Before the Ukraine war started, Russia reveled in its reputation as one of the world's most powerful military nations. Its weapons, it was thought, were among the best that anybody outside of the US produced. Russia earned billions of dollars from weapons sales, all while pushing the idea that what it built was powerful, lethal, unstoppable. Ukraine just proved Russia wrong. During a pair of strikes conducted in late September, Russia's unstoppable weapons were wiped off the map. Ukraine destroyed them all, with the strikes likely to impact in two key areas of the war. We start with a trip to the Crimean Peninsula and the air defense system Russia claims is among the very best the world has to offer, the S-400. Touted as a system that can take out almost any aerial threat, the S-400 is one of Russia's most important weapons when it comes to defending its position in Crimea. But thanks to Ukraine, one of those S-400s is now out of commission. Ukraine didn't attack the S-400 itself. That would be foolhardy. The S-400 comes loaded with missiles that can take out slow-moving drones and other projectiles, so a head-on assault isn't ideal. Such an assault can still work, especially when using a horde of projectiles that make it impossible for the S-400 to destroy everything. But Ukraine is smarter than that. Why use a horde, which costs money and contains drones that could be used elsewhere, when you could use a single drone to render Russia's S-400 obsolete? Don't attack the S-400, attack its radar. That's the approach Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, or SSO, took on September 30th when it destroyed a radar station linked to one of Russia's S-400 air defense systems, the Kyiv Post reports. That station serves as the eyes for the S-400, allowing the system to detect and then fire upon incoming threats. If you take away the eyes, the S-400 can only fire blindly into the air, assuming it can fire at all. In air defense, where precision is the name of the game due to the need to deal with fast-moving targets, blind firing is the last thing Russia wants to do with its expensive S-400 missiles. Ukraine's clever and precise strike just took out an S-400's entire combat capability without Ukraine having to sacrifice drones to a head-on assault. And the SSO is more than happy to talk about it. Taking to Telegram to announce Ukraine's latest strike, the SSO said, "On the night of September 30th, units of the Special Operations Forces hit the radar station of the S-400 Triumph anti-aircraft missile system." Ukraine's strike also delivered no small sense of irony and symbolism, as the SSO added, "It's symbolic that the enemy's expensive air defense system, aimed in particular at UAVs, was neutralized by SSO strike drones," the SSO says on Telegram. The radar station is the eyes of the S-400 Triumph complex. Without the observation and guidance element, the entire system loses its combat capability. Ukraine just disabled an S-400 with the very weapon the S-400 is supposed to counter. Beyond this statement, the SSO didn't provide much more information. No photographs or footage of the strike have been shared, which also makes it impossible to determine where in Crimea Ukraine took out the S-400 radar station. However, there are some possible hints. In the wake of the SSO's strike, the Crimean Wind Telegram channel shared that explosions had been heard in a couple of districts during the early hours of the morning of September 30th. That explains the explosions our subscribers heard last night, the channel reports. The Kyiv Post adds that the subscribers that Crimean Wind mentions had reported loud explosions in the Leninsky and Feodosia districts of the peninsula. Were these explosions related to Ukraine's drones decimating an S-400 radar station? And if they were, does that mean Ukraine carried out more than one attack on Crimea on September 30th? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers to these questions because the SSO doesn't want to give anything more away than it already has. It would rather leave Russia guessing about what it's just done and what it plans to do next. Of course, we don't have to guess too much about why Ukraine needs to take out as many S-400s as possible. The system represents one of the most vital parts of Russia's air defense strategy. Missile threat provides the basic information that highlights why the S-400 is such an important weapon for Russia. It's a surface-to-air missile system that is highly mobile and capable of engaging almost any aerial target. That includes drones, cruise missiles, aircraft, and even ballistic missiles that have reached the terminal phase of their descent toward a target. Some of the system's missiles can travel for up to 400 kilometers or around 250 miles, though others are more limited in range. Russia also has the choice of using the 48N6 missile, which hosts a 143 kilogram or 315 pound high-explosive fragmentation warhead, or the 77N6. That second missile has a warhead that weighs the same as the one used in the 48N6, but it has hit-to-kill properties rather than being a typical high-explosive warhead. Up until 2021, which saw the introduction of the S-500, the S-400 was Russia's most advanced air defense system. The Kyiv Post says that the system is even supposed to be comparable to the US Patriot, which Ukraine has used extensively to tackle Russian airstrikes. This may not be the most accurate comparison, as the Patriot has performed better than the S-400 during the war. However, the basic functionality seems similar. S-400s have radar stations, as we already know, launchers, and systems capable of automatically detecting and designating targets. These systems, down to each missile selection and launch, are supposedly fully automated. The S-400 also seems to be somewhat modular. According to the Kyiv Post, an S-400 system can operate up to 40 launchers, though it doesn't have to use that many. Each of these launchers can hold 4 missiles, providing a total of 160 missiles for a full S-400 unit. The S-400's radar and tracking systems can also identify and order strikes on up to 80 targets simultaneously, with each of those targets getting a double dose of missiles. It's all impressive stuff, and these specifications also prove our earlier point that using a drone horde to hit an S-400 head-on isn't the most economical idea. It can work as long as the horde has at least 80 drones. Any less than that, and Ukraine would run the risk of losing all of its drones before any of them scored a direct hit. Hence the strike on the radar station. Taking out that single station means that Russia now has up to 160 S-400 missiles installed in launchers that are practically useless. So Ukraine took out an air defense system that was supposed to be unstoppable. Here's why that matters. The S-400 that Ukraine just disabled is based in Crimea, which is home to several of these systems along its northwestern coast. That shows you how much Vladimir Putin values Crimea. Each S-400 costs anywhere between $200 million and $1.2 billion, depending on who you listen to. Even at the lower end of the price scale, this is a very expensive system, which highlights both its supposed power and just how important Crimea is to Putin. However, Putin sending so many S-400s to Crimea is a problem for Russia. The first indication of that problem came in May, when Pravda reported on the Ukrainian Navy's claims that Russia was pulling more of its air defenses to Crimea. The Navy spokesperson, Dmitry Pletenchuk, outlined an emerging issue for Russia that Putin either wasn't aware of or didn't seem to care about. Crimea is valuable to Russia both symbolically and logistically, Pletenchuk said. The density of air defense systems on the island is greater than it is in many Russian regions. The Russians are limited in their ability to replenish their losses due to the sanctions and lack of microelectronics. In other words, Putin is creating blind spots by moving so many of Russia's air defenses to Crimea. Fast forward to September, and Ukraine has started taking advantage of these blind spots. We published an in-depth video covering how, so check it out if you want to learn more about how Putin's obsession with Crimea is putting the Russian mainland at greater risk. Now, think about this. Pletenchuk noted that Russia is struggling to build or maintain its air defense systems due to sanctions limiting its ability to get its hands on the required components and microelectronics. An S-400 radar station would almost certainly fall within that category of things that Russia is struggling to build at the moment. So Ukraine taking out an S-400 radar station in Crimea isn't just about weakening Russia's hold on the peninsula, as we'll get into in a moment. It's about weakening the Russian mainland. Putin's obsession with holding onto Crimea is such that he's likely to prioritize the replacement of the destroyed radar station. Given that a repair is likely impossible, that means he's going to have to take a radar station from another S-400 and send it to Crimea. Of course, the S-400 that loses its radar station becomes as blind as the one that Ukraine just struck. Putin will end up sacrificing air defenses somewhere else in Russia to maintain Crimea's strength. That creates gaps. And in gaps, Ukraine sees opportunities to conduct more of the long-range strikes with which it has battered Russia throughout 2025. Let's come back to Russia's weakened hold on Crimea. This has been an issue for Putin for some time, as Ukraine has focused strike after strike on Crimea's air defenses and military installations. For instance, late August into early September alone saw Ukraine take out 6 pieces of Russian equipment in the space of a few days. All were in Crimea. All were valuable to Russia, and you can find out more about them in our video covering Ukraine's devastating series of strikes. These sorts of strikes are part of what the Atlantic Council called a slow and steady weakening of Russia's grip on Crimea back in October 2024. Even over a year ago, Ukraine was striking targets of great military importance in Crimea, the outlet says. Combining those strikes with attacks on the Black Sea Fleet that have rendered that once feared assortment of ships practically useless, then you get a strategy of chipping away at the Crimean armor. Putin ends up in a catch-22 situation. Either he weakens mainland Russia by replacing destroyed equipment in Crimea, or he loosens his grip on Crimea by keeping that equipment, which is needed to guard against strikes on the Russian mainland where it is. This is a no-win situation for Russia because Ukraine gets what it wants either way. Ukraine can take steps closer to Crimea or conduct more strikes against refineries and other military assets inside Russia. Still, Putin might think, Russia can at least maintain the strength of its offensive inside Ukraine, even with all of these air defense problems. But maybe that isn't the case anymore. Which brings us to the second of the pair of strikes we mentioned in the introduction to the video. This time we head to Kharkiv, which is a region that seems to have been under a non-stop assault by Russia ever since Putin launched his invasion. On September 30th, the Kyiv Post reported that Ukraine had managed to destroy 2 Russian TOS-1A Salt-Sepyok multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, inside Kharkiv. Ukraine's 429th Separate Achilles Drone Regiment carried out the 2 strikes, the outlet says. In both cases, the regiment used drones to get the job done, just as it did in Crimea. And there's footage to prove it. Released to coincide with the September 29th strike, which occurred just hours after Ukraine destroyed the S-400 radar station in Crimea, that footage is on YouTube and available to view. Published by the 429th Separate Achilles Drone Regiment itself, the video lasts for about 50 seconds, and it appears to showcase 2 strikes conducted using first-person view or FPV drones. First, we see grainy footage being shot by one of the drones. It's difficult to make anything out until the drone adjusts its course slightly. That's when the target comes into view. One of Russia's Salt-Sepyok MLRS appears, almost seeming illuminated against the much darker backdrop. Ukraine's drone descends, careens towards its target, and then explodes. The video then switches to footage being shot by another FPV drone as it scours the Kharkiv landscape looking for its target. It finds that target pretty quickly. The second Salt-Sepyok MLRS is on the move, but it isn't going fast enough. Ukraine's drone zeroes in and scores a direct hit, taking out the second of Russia's powerful MLRS. All of this is impressive enough, but footage of FPV strikes like this come out of Ukraine almost daily. What about this particular pair of strikes makes them so special? The answer lies in the weapon that Ukraine took out. The Salt-Sepyok MLRS isn't just any rocket launcher. It's a $15 million weapon that is considered legendary inside Russia, the Kyiv Post reports. Oh, and it also happens to be an MLRS that is capable of launching thermobaric rockets, which are among the most devastating of the conventional munitions that Russia has in its arsenal. We'll explain why limiting Russia's use of these dangerous rockets is a major win in a moment. First, let's explore the Salt-Sepyok MLRS in a bit more detail. According to Army recognition, the Salt-Sepyok MLRS is often referred to as a heavy flamethrower, rather than a conventional rocket launcher. It's mobile thanks to being installed on the tank chassis of T-72, and it's designed to offer fire support to assaulting infantry and tank regiments. Its most important feature is its block launcher, which can carry up to 24 220mm guided pipes that allow it to rattle off a veritable mob of rockets and unguided missiles at a target. Crewed by 3 people, the Salt-Sepyok MLRS can reach a top speed of 60 km or 37.2 miles per hour and has a range of 550 km, which amounts to about 341 miles. This mobility means that Russia can deploy its terrifying MLRS for one assault, only to move it on to the next when it's done its job. It's not quite a perfect weapon, though. Despite its supposedly legendary status, the Salt-Sepyok MLRS has several weaknesses, the Kyiv Post points out. Its lack of armor is one of them. The weapon is essentially an MLRS strapped onto the top of a tank chassis, which makes it vulnerable to the same kinds of weapons that have been destroying Russia's tanks during the invasion. Anti-tank missiles and grenade launchers offer threats that are dangerous to a Salt-Sepyok MLRS. Plus, as we've already seen, drones can descend on the MLRS without it being able to do a thing about them. How could it? If the Salt-Sepyok MLRS tries to fire its rockets at Ukraine's drones, there's almost no chance of it scoring a direct hit. Even if it does, Russia really doesn't want it to when Russian troops are in close range. Why? We've already told you, the Salt-Sepyok MLRS launches thermobaric rockets. It's this fact that leads many to designate it as a heavy flamethrower due to how thermobaric weapons work. And it's the system's ability to fire these kinds of rockets that showcases why it's important that Ukraine just destroyed 2 Salt-Sepyok MLRS. Both The Guardian and the BBC explained why thermobaric weapons are so lethal back in 2022. Russia had started using them almost from the outset of the invasion, leading to an outcry over the cruelty of utilizing what is often referred to as a vacuum bomb against Ukraine. The alternative name hints at what happens when a thermobaric weapon detonates. The BBC explains that thermobaric weapons consist of a fuel container and a pair of explosive charges. When the weapon hits its target, the first explosive charge breaks open the fuel container, scattering its contents into the surrounding environment as a cloud. Then, the second explosion happens. That second explosion detonates the entire cloud, which is capable of seeping into buildings and defenses that aren't totally sealed. A massive fireball erupts, scorching anything unlucky enough to be caught inside. As if that wasn't enough, this huge fireball sucks up all of the oxygen from the surrounding area, creating the vacuum that gives the weapon its nickname. The fireball doesn't get you, the lack of oxygen will. These devastating effects make thermobaric weapons controversial, as they're much more damaging to structures and human life than a regular explosive. And Russia loves using them. Speaking to The Guardian in March 2022, Australian Strategic Policy Institute senior analyst Dr. Marcus Hellier said, "One of the things we know about Russian tactics is that they are willing to destroy everything." He added, "It's clear that the Ukrainians are hunkering down in some of the cities. As that continues, the Russians are going to resort more and more to using whatever weapons they have, including thermobaric weapons in built-up urban areas. Kharkiv is one of those cities where Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have hunkered down since the war began. Perhaps it's no coincidence that 2 Salt-Sepyok MLRS were in the Kharkiv region. Now neither can launch the thermobaric rockets Russia has used in Kharkiv in the past, which relieves a lot of pressure on Ukraine. After all, Kharkiv is still a target for Russia. Putin may have claimed that it isn't. Back in May 2024, Russia's leader lied through his teeth by claiming that he wasn't interested in capturing Kharkiv. In a quote published by Politico at the time, Putin even blamed Ukraine for Russia's constant assaults on Kharkiv. "When it comes to what is happening around Kharkiv, that's their fault too," Putin claimed, "because they have been shelling and sadly continue to target residential neighborhoods in the border areas including Belgorod. And I've said publicly that if this will continue, we'll be forced to create a safe zone, a sanitary zone. That's what we are doing. It's not about capturing Kharkiv," Putin claimed. "It was about protecting Russia's border regions." That's a flimsy justification for what Russia is doing in Kharkiv. Now that we're in 2025, Russia's strikes aren't relenting. The presence of 2 Salt-Sepyok MLRS in the region tells us exactly what Russia had in store if Ukraine's FPV drones hadn't taken those rocket systems out. Kharkiv is also regularly a victim of Russia's airstrikes. In June, one of these strikes, which involved the use of drones, guided bombs and missiles, killed at least 4 people in the city. The reality is that Russia wants Kharkiv. Thanks to Ukraine's drone attack, taking that city has just become a whole lot harder. Russians have got to wake up and accept reality, US Vice President J.D. Vance said on September 28th. "A lot of people are dying and they don't have a lot to show for it." Those words would already be damaging enough to Vladimir Putin as they come from a nation that he thought he'd successfully influenced into supporting Russia just a few short months ago. But there's an extra sting in the tail of Vance's statement. It's not just the US that is saying Russia has already lost the war. Russians are too. In a huge blow to Putin, Russians are admitting that the Ukraine war is already lost. It wasn't supposed to go like this for Putin. When his forces first rolled into Ukraine back in February 2022, he expected any Ukrainian resistance to be crushed swiftly. Sure, Russia might experience a few losses, but the tanks would roll into Kyiv and Ukraine would have no other option but to capitulate, much as they had to when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. The problem started when Ukraine fought back, hard. Russia's unprepared forces were pushed back, losing many of the early gains made during the initial special military operation. Western military aid started flooding in. Ukraine revolutionized modern warfare with its use of drones. And now here we are, getting closer and closer to 4 years since Putin launched his invasion. Ukraine is not only still standing, but it's doing tremendous damage to Russia's military. If taking Ukraine was supposed to be the win condition for Russia, then Russia has already lost. And now some of Russia's most prominent voices are saying as much. One of those voices belongs to Tatiana Montian. Far from being among those in Russia who regularly oppose Putin, Montian is a pro-Kremlin propagandist, the Kyiv Independent points out. Towing the party line is her stock in trade, meaning she spent the last few years regurgitating whatever Putin wants her to say in order to convince the Russian people that Putin's war is going better than it seems. Not anymore, it seems. During a September 22nd interview, Montian said that the situation was now so bad for Russia that it would soon have to do something drastic. A second round of mobilization is on the horizon if there's no major breakthrough in this spring-autumn campaign, Montian said during the interview. It doesn't look like that breakthrough is coming, she adds. In the first half of September, the pace of the offensive slowed significantly. They may have committed their last reserves, Montian claimed of the Russian military in Ukraine. This isn't a Western commentator that the Kremlin can claim is biased. Montian is one of Putin's own. And now she's revealing things about Russia's manpower and territorial gains situation that are at odds with the Kremlin's official line. She's not the only one either. Just a day before Montian gave her interview, Dmitry Rogozin was making similar comments. Rogozin also falls into the pro-Kremlin camp. He's important enough that Putin has installed him as the Russian senator who represents the occupied portions of Zaporizhia, which means his voice carries weight when it comes to what's happening in that sector. Rogozin's voice says that Russia is losing. Interviewed by Russian media outlet Bloknot, Rogozin was asked point-blank why Russia hasn't managed to win in Ukraine yet. He made some excuses, stating, "Our side is just us, the army and the navy, Russia's 2 allies. The Navy is currently less involved for obvious reasons, and on the other side, there's a host of high-tech countries that have sided with the Kyiv putschist regime. While this looks like Rogozin is trying to play the poor little Russia card, reading between the lines tells us the real story. The weight of Western sanctions weighs down on Russia, Rogozin says, and that's starting to have an effect on the battlefield. Russia, once thought to be one of the world's strongest military nations, doesn't have enough of any of the things that it needs to make substantial territorial advances. Ukraine's drones are a problem, Rogozin says. Ukraine has 10 times more drones than Russia, he claims, and Russia can't do anything about it because Ukraine's drone manufacturers operate underground and out of Russia's range. The map is moving with great difficulty at a colossal price paid by our troops for advancement, Rogozin adds. It's that colossal price that links Rogozin's comments to Montian's. Both of these pro-Kremlin commentators are making the point that Russia is losing in Ukraine because it's paying too high a price in Russian blood for the tiny gains it's making inside Ukraine. But we'll come back to that point in a moment. Rogozin's comments didn't go unnoticed by one of Russia's former proxy leaders in occupied Ukraine. Pavel Gubaryev is a former pro-Russian proxy and people's governor in Donetsk, took to Telegram to share his thoughts on what Rogozin said. He made the logical point that Russia's losses are so heavy because it is on the offensive, whereas Ukraine is on the defensive. Ukraine's military is quite happy with this situation, he says, especially now that it's started to strike Russia's oil refineries. Gubaryev shared that 26% of Russia's refining capacity has now been destroyed or damaged due to these strikes, which bog down the wheels of the Russian war machine as much as the country's massive casualty rate. These refinery strikes also grant Ukraine a ton of leverage because it's hitting Russia on its territory. That's yet another thing that Putin never expected to happen when he launched his invasion. Then Gubaryev said something that Putin would never have expected to hear from one of his former proxies. At the same time, Russian propaganda continues to mislead the public into believing that the Ukrainian armed forces are close to defeat, while we are grinding down the enemy and will soon win. However, the situation is stalemate and in fact constitutes defeat, Gubaryev declared. Constitutes defeat? That's a bold claim, but it's one that sees Gubaryev suggest that Russia's propagandists, all the way up until Putin, have been lying to the country's people. Russia isn't about to win. It's not making any progress, and it's losing far too many people, Gubaryev is saying, and he caps off his Telegram statement with a shocking message. There is no possibility of ending the central military district with a victory while Russia's colonial system of power remains intact. Did Gubaryev, who once was so important to Putin that Russia's leader installed him into a position of power in Donetsk, just call for the overthrow of Russia's government? It certainly sounds like it from that comment. But it seems as though Gubaryev is just reflecting an increasing feeling of anger toward Putin that is being felt throughout Russia. The average Russian is either starting to figure out that the Kremlin has been lying to them for years, or now that the death count is so high, they're starting to get brave enough to speak out where they may not have done so before. The Kyiv Independent offers the perfect example of what seems to be a wellspring of anti-Putin sentiment growing inside Russia. Before any of these comments by what are supposed to be pro-Kremlin propagandists came to life, Russia's state-controlled television channel NTV broadcast a live political talk show named Meeting Place. The September 19th edition of that show featured one guest who argued that the numbers regarding Ukraine's losses that the Kremlin is sharing with everyday Russians are simply impossible. With the outbreak of hostilities, the Ukrainian army went up to 800,000 people. Then along the way, it increased by somewhere near 100,000 to 120,000 per year, the guest pointed out. Thus, there can be no 1.7 million to 2 million losses because in that case, the Ukrainian army simply would not exist. There's an interesting figure. Based on this, we can surmise that the Kremlin is telling its people that Ukraine has lost up to 2 million people, which just so happens to be about double Russia's casualty rate per Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. As the guest notes, that just isn't possible. Ukraine's resistance would have crumbled long before now if this were the case. The conversation even went a little further. Meeting Place's host asked the guest if they believed that the Russian Ministry of Defense was lying to the people. The guest's response was stunning. "Not only ours," he replied, before adding that it's a huge mistake to underestimate the Ukrainian army. Think about the implications here. These are comments being made by an everyday Russian that seem to reveal what many inside the country think about Putin and the bloody war into which he has led his people. But more than that, these comments were actually broadcast live on state-owned television. The situation is growing so bad for Putin that even the outlets that the Kremlin controls are growing so restless that they're willing to air dissent. Perhaps it's no coincidence that all of the commentators who began making claims that Russia is losing the Ukraine war started speaking up after this interview. A watershed may have just been broken. Now, Putin is at the risk of being washed away by the tide of increasingly negative public opinion. Let's bring things back to the point Gabariev made that Russia is losing the war. This is an admission, though not quite in the way you might think. Gabariev, along with the rest of these commentators, isn't saying that Russia has lost in the sense that its military is about to collapse thanks to Ukraine's defense. This isn't a traditional type of loss where one side obliterates the other. The loss comes as a result of several factors. First, as we mentioned in the introduction, the special military operation that was supposed to last a handful of days has dragged on for years. That's a loss in its own right, because it showed the world that Russia is nowhere near as effective a military nation as people had believed it to be for decades. So the first loss is the humiliation caused by the failure to obtain a quick victory. The second, and far more important, loss comes from the emerging fact that Russia can't win. That may sound strange, but an attacking nation that fails to advance loses just as much as a nation that is destroyed by an attacker. This is Russia's problem. For all of the resources, including its people, it's thrown at Ukraine, it's achieved virtually nothing when it comes to grabbing territory. Instead, each day that passes brings with it more death and more signs that Russia is eventually going to have to give up on its goal of stripping Ukraine of its sovereignty. What are these signs of an impending Russian loss? How about we start with Russia's tiny territorial gains? The Kyiv Independent highlights just how terrible these gains have been for Russia in 2025. Bear in mind that this was the year when Putin launched Russia's summer offensive against Ukraine. At the outset of this offensive, Putin declared, "All Ukraine is ours," the Atlantic Council wrote on September 2nd. Russia's president added that there are reasons to believe we can finish off Ukraine's forces back in March, suggesting that Putin was confident that a Russian victory was imminent. Or maybe he wasn't confident. Perhaps he was lying to his people again. The summer offensive is over, and the numbers are in. A combination of Ukrainian mapping and data from the deep state open source intelligence organization says that Russia's grand summer offensive saw it capture 1,548 square kilometers, which is roughly 597 square miles. Granted, that was more Ukrainian territory than Russia managed to occupy between June and August of 2024, but it still only amounts to a tiny 0.256% of Ukraine's total territory. If you take the whole of 2025 into account, the numbers start to look even worse. Between January 1st and August 31st, Russia lost 210,000 of its soldiers to death or injury. The summer offensive's failure bumped the number up higher than it might have otherwise been, but this is still loss at a scale unlike anything Putin would have expected when he invaded Ukraine. And 2024 was even worse for Russia. Last year, Al Jazeera reports Russia managed to gain just 4,168 square kilometers, which equates to 1,609 square miles, at a cost of 427,000 of its soldiers. That's a total of 637,000 Russian troops gone in return for less than 1% of Ukraine since the beginning of 2024. We've already said it, but it bears repeating, this isn't sustainable. No matter how much Russia recruits, it can't keep claiming that it's on the edge of victory when the numbers show how little progress it's actually making. This is a war of attrition that Russia started, and Russia is losing. Of course, Putin doesn't want anybody to realize that's the case, that's why he lies. But on September 30th, Dargans reported that he'd been caught out in one of those lies. It all started when Russia's Ministry of Defense published a map on its Telegram channel. Nothing seemed untoward at first glance. The ministry claimed that the map showcased Russia's territorial gains since the beginning of 2025, and while those supposed gains could be disputed, all seemed pretty normal. However, some eagle-eyed people discovered that normal was the last thing that this map was. The map wasn't modern. In fact, it was at least 50 years old, as evidenced by a city named Siversk being labeled as Yama on the map. Siversk hasn't been called Yama since 1973. There were other naming issues too, including the map using names for cities that Russia had previously abandoned but the Ukraine had adopted. Bakhmut was labeled as Bakhmut, for instance. That doesn't seem like a problem, right? However, Russia doesn't call Bakhmut by that name, though it used to do so decades ago, Dargan says. It sort of started using the name every so often in official documents, but when combined with the Yama issue, this use of Bakhmut is more evidence that Russia is using an old map. What we seem to have here is an attempt by Russia to use an old map to misrepresent its territorial gains. With one map, Russia's Ministry of Defense shot its own credibility in the foot. What reason would it have to use such an old map if it wasn't trying to smudge the numbers? Perhaps the map used old city lines that no longer exist, making it seem like Russia gained more ground than it had. Or maybe Russia is genuinely relying on decades-old maps, and it legitimately has no actual idea just how little territory it's claiming. It's hard to say. But Russia messed up here and only added fuel to the fire of the argument that it's losing the Ukraine war. Speaking of losing, that brings us to the second sign that Russia is doing just that. Russia may soon need to mobilize. Montian hinted at this with her comments that Russia may have burned through the last of its reserves during the summer, meaning that Putin is going to have to find manpower from somewhere. He absolutely doesn't want to find more soldiers through mobilization. Russia did that before, in late 2022, and it didn't go over well. With the Russian government touting that at least 50,000 of the recently drafted are now in Ukraine, a long list of complaints is emerging. Lack of leadership from mid-ranking officers, tactics that lead to heavy casualties, non-existent training, promised payments not received, CNN reported in November 2022. Beyond this anger on the front lines, the wives and mothers of these mobilized soldiers left behind also expressed their fury. By the end of 2023, Chatham House was claiming that these family members were a growing threat to Putin as they continued to organize protests, petitions, and appeals. These aren't minor little headaches for Putin. These protests were signs of the internal anger that seems to have been crystallized by the NTV caller, who outright said that Russia is lying to its people. Putin knows that another round of mobilization would tip his people over the edge. Nevertheless, he's still seeking what Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty called expendable manpower. A massive recruitment network has been created in Russia, but it still may not be enough. By September, UA Wire was reporting that Russia is once again weighing up the possibility of mobilization as it prepares for a fall offensive that could drag on into the winter. Russia is recruiting about 35,000 soldiers per month, the outlet notes. But it adds that some analysts believe that Russia isn't offsetting its Ukraine war losses, which means mobilization may have to happen. This is a clear sign that Russia is losing. Remember, this was supposed to be a quick and easy invasion. It wasn't meant to cost Russia so much that it would be forced to mobilize twice, while relying on hefty pay packets to entice contract soldiers. Eventually, Putin is going to run out of soldiers, which will either force him to abandon his Ukraine ambitions or make a decision that could turn an increasingly restless public against him. Either way, Russia loses and Putin knows that it's coming. That brings us to the final sign that Russia has lost the Ukraine war. Putin believes as much himself. You'll never hear Russia's president say it, of course. However, one of America's most prominent military figures says that the feeling within the Kremlin is that Russia has lost the Ukraine war. That figure is the US President's Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. On September 30th, United 24 media reported on comments Kellogg made while speaking at the Warsaw Security Forum. I think deep down, he, Putin, realizes he's not going to win. It's a losing fight for him in the long term. It's not going to happen, Kellogg claimed. He added that Ukraine is making that long-term prospect even bleaker with its strikes against Russia's oil refining. Each strike limits the amount of gasoline and diesel Russia can send to its troops, sell to other countries, and provide to its citizens. Anything that deprives Russia of oil dollars is a good move, Kellogg says, because it will push Putin even closer to the realization that many inside Russia have already reached. The Ukraine war has become unwinnable for Russia. And if the war is unwinnable, that means Russia has lost.
By now, it's no big secret that Russia has been using a shadow fleet of illicit vessels to ferry oil and other products around the world. It's one of the main ways that Russia is able to fund its invasion of Ukraine, even if the country does everything that it can to hide its use of these ships. But the shadow fleet secret goes much deeper than what's already known. Why? Russia has started using these ships for a lot more than transporting oil. Putin's shadow fleet has been busted, as Ukraine has just exposed Russia's darkest secret. And that secret is something that will be revealed in a moment. First, a little context on what the shadow fleet is, or at least what it's supposed to be. Soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, thousands of sanctions followed. Many of those sanctions targeted Russia's oil and gas sectors, along with the companies and ships that both make these valuable products and ensure that they get to the customers who buy them. This was a smart move by the collective West. Russia had just enjoyed a bumper year for these fossil fuels in 2021. Sales had skyrocketed past initial estimates to the point where the money Russia generated from oil and gas accounted for 36% of Russia's total budget, Reuters reported in January 2022. Actual sales were 51.3% above previous estimates, leading to Russia making almost $500 million per day in October 2021 alone. Billions pour into Russia thanks to fossil fuels. The West's logic was that sanctions would take those billions away, wiping out the financial foundation of Putin's war machine in the process. It was sound logic, but it was undercut by Russia doing something that the West didn't expect. As sanctions started to take hold, something strange started happening. Massive ships, often oil tankers, started appearing. These ships often went to great pains to obscure the identities of their owners, as Brookings explained. A focal point of the Shadow Fleet strategy is to obscure the ownership of the fleet's tankers and to mask the origin of the Russian oil those ships carry. To do this, Russia employs a host of deceptive maneuvers, such as repeated ship-to-ship transfers of liquid cargo, blending oil from multiple countries, spoofing ships' location data, and automatic identification system blackouts. By the second half of 2024, Shadow Fleet ships accounted for 60% of the crude oil departing Russia's Baltic terminals, the outlet says. And though this had declined to 40% by March 2025, the initial intention behind the Shadow Fleet is obvious. They were moneymakers, cheap and often old ships that Russia could use without telling anybody, so it could still bring money into the country. But face it, none of this is a secret. By now, the Shadow Fleet is, at best, an open secret. The entire world knows that it exists, even though Russia still tries to act like it doesn't. So, if how the Shadow Fleet has worked for the last few years isn't the big secret that Ukraine has just revealed about these clandestine vessels, then what is? The Kyiv Independent reported on that big secret on September 28. It says that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, chose that date to deliver an important message to the rest of the world via his evening address. Intelligence now indicates that the Russians are using tankers to launch and operate drones against European countries. This is yet more evidence why the Baltic Sea and other seas must be closed to Russian tankers, at the very least to the Shadow Fleet. Catch Russia's dark secret? If it wasn't clear, here's the explanation. Russia is no longer using the Shadow Fleet to evade sanctions against its oil and gas sectors. That was already shady. But that clearly wasn't enough for Putin. The dark secret is that now Russia is using the Shadow Fleet as an extension of its military navy. The drones that have been invading the territory of European Union and NATO-aligned nations are being launched from these hidden ships. This is huge. According to Zelensky, the Shadow Fleet has evolved. It's no longer just a problem that needs to be solved to prevent Russia from generating the oil and gas money it needs to keep the Ukraine war going. Now, the fleet is an instrument of warfare in and of itself. Russia is using these ships to launch hybrid warfare attacks against countries other than Ukraine, which has turned the Shadow Fleet into a threat against all of NATO. And those drone incursions have been getting more frequent over the last few weeks. Euronews provides a breakdown in a September 30 analysis of the countries that have spotted Russian drones in their airspace. Poland has grabbed all the headlines, of course. On September 9, the country's defense ministry reported that at least 19 Russian drones had flown into Polish airspace in what the country dubbed as an act of aggression by Russia. Poland deployed its air defenses and shot down several of the drones. This incident, combined with Russia sending a trio of MiG-31s into Estonian airspace just a few days later, triggered Poland to warn Russia that anything it sends into Polish airspace in the future will be shot down. Find out more about that threat, whether NATO supports it, and how Russia responded in our video. Now, this single drone incursion would be enough to demonstrate that Putin has escalated his hybrid warfare strategy against Europe. But what happened in Poland was only one of at least 10 instances of Russian drones entering countries where they shouldn't be. Lithuania is one of the 10. It reported that one of Russia's drones entered its territory on July 28. Romania has also experienced a pair of incursions during September, the first occurring a day before Poland had to deal with Russia's drones. The second incursion took place on September 13. Denmark and Norway have both had to deal with Russian drones near airports and military sites during the second half of September. The same goes for France, with Germany also reporting sightings of Russian drones on its territory. Latvia and Estonia have also had to deal with drones. Previously, it was assumed that these drones were reaching European countries after being launched inside Russia or from one of its puppet states, such as Belarus. But now, that doesn't seem to be the case. As Putin attempts to intimidate the NATO nations offering military aid and support to Ukraine, he's sending out the Shadow Fleet to serve as launch platforms for Russia's drones. Those drones haven't attacked yet. Every incursion has just involved them being spotted and in some cases shot down. But with all of this, Russia's leader is trying to send a message. He wants NATO to know that Russia can strike anywhere in Europe. And if it does, the Shadow Fleet that nobody has been able to stop will be just as likely to attack as Russia's official military vessels. Of course, Putin will never give voice to this message. The whole point of the Shadow Fleet is to obfuscate what Russia is doing behind layers of misdirection and outright deceit. Plausible deniability is the goal here. as the last thing that Putin wants is for the West to designate his shadow fleet as a legitimate target against which NATO and the European Union can strike. And that attempt to act like nothing is happening can be seen in Russia's responses to the reported drone incursions. It's denying that it ever happened, of course. That's according to Newsweek, which also reported on Zelensky's shadow fleet revelation in a September 29 article. Russia is trying to claim that none of what's happening is intentional. It's just a coincidence that there have been 10 separate instances of drones entering NATO airspace since July, with most of those instances in September. And Russia definitely didn't mean to send its fighter jets into Estonia's airspace. It's all a big coincidence, and NATO should be careful about doing anything in response. Of course, all of this is nonsense. Russia's lies could be slightly believable if its drone incursions were limited to Poland and the Baltic nations. Those countries border Ukraine and in some cases Russia, so it's plausible, even if it's unlikely, that misdirected drones launched in Russia and intended for Ukraine could end up in those nations' airspace. But Germany, France, Denmark, the veil behind which Russia is trying to hide falls apart when its drones end up going too deep into Europe. Russia's denials mean nothing. And now, according to Zelensky, Europe's emerging Russian drone problem has evolved to the point where the Shadow Fleet is being used as a collective launch platform. The fleet is becoming a bigger problem than ever, a military problem. And the question has to be asked, what does the revelation of Russia's dark secret mean for the future? First, Russia's using its shadow fleet for these drone incursions is an intelligent move for the simple fact that this fleet exists in something of a legal grey area. The Economist highlighted this in a September 30 article, where it covered how NATO's military navies are going to struggle to contain what it dubs the flashing red threat from Russia's dark fleet. The problem isn't necessarily identifying which ships are part of Russia's shadow fleet. While Russia tries to hide these ships, identification has happened plenty of times to the point where sanctions are being placed against hundreds of the ships in the fleet. NATO's members can figure out what these ships are, even when they're operating. The problem is that it can't do much about the shadow fleet. It's incredibly difficult to enforce any international shipping rules on the shadow fleet, for instance. That's by Russian design. The fleet exists to break international law and skirt sanctions in the first place. And even when a shadow fleet ship is caught in territory where it shouldn't be operating, traditional legal channels often don't work. Finland has learned that the hard way, as The Economist points out. Since the Eagle-S cut cables in the Gulf of Finland, Finnish prosecutors have struggled to prove that it was not by accident, or that the ship, which belongs to a company registered in the United Arab Emirates and sails under a Cook Islands flag, has a connection to Russia, the outlet reports. Russia's ship was all but caught in the act of cutting cables, and Finland is still struggling to do anything about it. So how can there be any legal recourse for a drone being launched from a shadow fleet vessel if that's the case? Russia won't dare launch one of these drones when a NATO ship is watching, and it will deny the drone ever came from a ship if it's discovered. It's also not like NATO personnel are going to start boarding Shadow Fleet vessels to see if there are drone operators on board. Evidence that will hold up in a court is going to be very difficult to come by. And even if it can be proven that drones entering European airspace come from a Shadow Fleet ship, Russia will just deny it anyway. NATO can at least send ships out to police its waters, but those NATO ships can't be everywhere at once. Plus, what do they do if they spot a Shadow Fleet vessel? Perhaps, if that ship is in NATO waters and caught in the act of launching a drone, NATO might have some recourse. Maybe one of its ships could even attack. Such an attack would put Putin in the awkward position of admitting that a Shadow Fleet ship is Russian, so he could decry the strike. But realistically, it's unlikely that NATO would risk the potential escalation. And that's the entire point. The Shadow Fleet allows Russia to launch hybrid attacks against NATO nations without any recourse, making it a valuable tool for Putin. And speaking of hybrid attacks, it's clear after the last few months of Russian drone incursions that unmanned aerial vehicles are becoming a bigger threat to Europe. That threat is only going to grow larger now that Russia's drones are apparently seaborne. Zelensky has already made this point. Ukraine's president used his appearance at the Warsaw Security Forum on September 29 to say that Russian drones currently represent the main threat, not just to Ukraine of the NATO nations on the eastern flank, but to all of Northern Europe. Zelensky also said that Ukraine would help Europe defend against Russia's drones. Ukraine proposes to Poland and all our partners to build a joint, fully reliable shield against Russian aerial threats, Zelensky said. This is possible. Ukraine can counter all kinds of Russian drones and missiles, and if we act together in the region, we will have enough weapons and production capacity. Zelensky's point is clearly that unity is the solution to Russia's drone threat. But how much Ukraine can actually contribute while it's still at war with Russia is anybody's guess. Europe is at least taking the Russian drone threat seriously, regardless of whether those drones are coming from the Shadow Fleet vessels. On October 1st, European Union leaders descended on Copenhagen to discuss the measures they can take to counter Russia's constant drone incursions. Denmark has made sure that the meeting is as secure as possible, to the point where it placed heavy traffic restrictions on Copenhagen's citizens and banned civilian drone flights until Friday. That ban is in place to avoid confusion between legal and potentially hostile drones and to ease the security burden during the summit. Still, this meeting is ongoing at the time of creating this video, so no outcomes can be reported yet. Ideally, the European Union will come up with some sort of plan for dealing with Russia's Shadow Fleet launched drones. But it's difficult to guess what such a plan would look like. For Putin, this latest use of the Shadow Fleet he's spent the past few years building is all about ambiguity. Russia's leader knows how challenging it is for NATO to do anything about his Shadow Fleet vessels without risking escalation, as tensions already approach the boiling point between Russia and NATO. So, Putin is going to keep using his drones to test European defences and unity, Euronews said in a September 30 article. There's even disagreement within Europe as to why, and even if, Russia is doing all of this in the first place. It's at least slightly possible that the Russian drones entering NATO airspace are doing so accidentally after being misdirected by Ukrainian electronic warfare techniques. That seems unlikely. Assuming the incursions are deliberate, is Russia provoking to test reactions? Is it using its drones to assess defensive capabilities? Is Russia just looking to create an atmosphere of fear in nations that they thought they were safe from Putin's expansionist ambitions? It could be all or none of these reasons. And the confusion about it all is exactly what Putin wants to create. Zelensky's claim about Russia's Shadow Fleet is doing only adds to this confusion. That claim could end up creating even more division among European leaders, some of whom may not believe that Russia would go so far until they see hard evidence. Maybe that's the whole point for Putin. His drones divide rather than conquer, and the Shadow Fleet could be just another piece of the puzzle Russia's leader is creating. But now that Russia's dark secret has been exposed, the question is, what can be done about it? Yet more sanctions seem to be the obvious answer. Zelensky called for them when revealing what Russia's Shadow Fleet has been up to. Those calls were mirrored by Svetlana Romanko, the founder of Razum We Stand, which is a lobbying group that calls for more sanctions to cut off Russia's energy exports. Romanko took aim at the US and its delayed secondary sanctions. The US should be placing full sanctions on all Russian fossil fuel exports, enforcing secondary sanctions on buyers of Russian oil, tightening restrictions on Putin's prize Arctic LNG, and shutting down the Shadow Fleet of tankers that carry Russia's bloodstained oil, Romanko claims. How useful sanctions will be against the Shadow Fleet is up for debate. After all, it's not like plenty of sanctions don't already exist. In July, the UK announced sanctions targeting 135 oil tankers that are part of the Russian Shadow Fleet. The European Union also placed sanctions on the 105 Shadow Fleet vessels as part of its 18th sanctions package, bringing its total of sanctioned ships to 444. It seems likely that the 19th package the European Union is currently preparing will target even more of Putin's shady ships. How effective these sanctions can actually be against ships that are already operating pseudo-legally at best is another question entirely. Sanctions on Russia says that these measures can be effective, though they're an imperfect response to the Shadow Fleet challenge. Sanctioned tankers don't disappear, but they become much less active, the outlet says when assessing the results of a study into sanctioning Shadow Fleet vessels. This creates friction and costs for Russia, since replacing sanctioned ships isn't easy. The study revealed that the travel distance of sanctioned Shadow Fleet vessels declines by 80%, meaning Russia is at least wary of sending these ships out once they're sanctioned. That wariness could at least mitigate the emerging Shadow Fleet drone issue, though it doesn't stop it entirely. After all, an 80% travel distance reduction indicates that these vessels aren't being kept in ports. They're still sailing, even if less so than before they were sanctioned, so Putin can still use them however he sees fit. So, sanctions help, but they don't solve. To really cut into the Shadow Fleet's operations, the European Union and NATO may also need to rely on Ukraine to conduct direct strikes in their stead. Ukraine has already started doing this. On September 13, Pravda reported that Ukraine's drones managed to strike a pair of Russian Shadow Fleet vessels at the Primorsk oil port. Ukraine is also using its drones to damage Russia's Black Sea oil ports, essentially hitting the Shadow Fleet indirectly by taking away the ports needed to load them with oil. Both approaches have their merits and they complement each other. Ukraine attacks while the West sanctions. Anything that stops Shadow Fleet vessels from taking to the seas needs to be considered, because if Russia is truly launching drones from these ships, that fleet just became a whole lot more dangerous. Ukraine could be about to receive an incredible upgrade to its arsenal, courtesy of the United States of America. Tomahawk missiles. With remarkable range and enormous explosive power, these game-changing missiles would unlock countless new possibilities, allowing Kyiv's forces to carry out destructive deep strikes far and wide across enemy territory. They have the power to bring Russia to its knees and break the will of Vladimir Putin himself, sending the war in a dramatic new direction. Here's why. Developed in the 1970s, the BGM-109 Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, or TLAM, is one of the most powerful land attack cruise missiles in the world. It brings 4 major advantages to the table when compared to other missiles. The first, and perhaps most important of those advantages, is range. Tomahawk missiles can travel extraordinary distances, striking targets up to 1,000 miles away from their launch locations. Some of the earlier Block 2 variants could actually go even further than that, travelling around 1,550 miles, but they were retired some years ago. Regardless, 1,000 miles is a massive distance, especially compared to countless other conventional missiles, many of which have much smaller maximum ranges. Europe's Storm Shadows, for instance, can only travel around 155 miles. Since they can hit targets so far away, Tomahawks open up countless avenues of attack and bring numerous targets into range, empowering their operators with almost unrivaled deep strike capabilities. At the same time, they strike fear into enemy forces. When they know their opponent can hit them anywhere at any time, it becomes much harder to predict their actions and take preventative measures to protect their people and their assets. But range wouldn't matter all that much if these missiles were slow-moving or easy to intercept. And that leads neatly onto the Tomahawk's second impressive advantage: agility. Despite measuring up at 20 feet in length with an 8.5-foot wingspan and total weight in excess of 3,300 pounds, these missiles are surprisingly nimble. Powered by Williams International F107 WR402 turbofan engines with TH Dimer fuel and solid fuel rocket boosters, Tomahawks reach peak speeds of around 570 miles per hour. That's not quite the speed of sound, putting Tomahawks in the subsonic missile category rather than supersonic or hypersonic, but it's still remarkably rapid. What's more, Tomahawks follow low-altitude flight paths, typically traveling around 100 to 150 feet above the ground. This makes them harder to detect on enemy radar screens, and more challenging to intercept as well, since the surrounding terrain essentially helps to hide the missiles as they follow their flight paths. In addition, Tomahawks are also able to use an array of guidance systems, including GPS, inertial navigation, and terrain contour matching to reach their intended targets. Thanks to this, Tomahawks almost always hit their targets, and even if enemy forces manage to spot an incoming missile, they often have very little time to react or respond to the threat. On top of all of that, Tomahawks are able to conduct evasive maneuvers mid-flight to minimize their risks of being intercepted, and the latest variants can even be reprogrammed en route to strike up to 15 pre-programmed alternative targets. Plus, they have the capacity to loiter over their targets for extended periods of time before striking, using their onboard cameras to provide valuable battlefield intelligence. This all makes Tomahawks incredibly difficult to deal with. Not only are they fast and agile, but they're also unpredictable. Even if enemy forces think they know where a Tomahawk is headed, its operators could easily adjust its flight path and pick a different target to catch their opponent off guard. As Federico Borsari, a fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, puts it, it's a very fast though still subsonic cruise missile. It uses a combination of different guidance systems to be very accurate. In an interview with the Kyiv Independent, Borsari added, "Currently, I would say it's the main tool for the US to strike land targets very far away and is launched mostly from naval platforms, including submarines and surface ships. Once it reaches its targets, the Tomahawk has the firepower necessary to deal devastating damage, which leads us onto its third important advantage, strength. The most powerful Tomahawk variants can be equipped with high explosive warheads weighing up to 1,000 pounds. They may also be fitted with sub-munition dispensers and BLU-97B combined effects bombs. Put simply, these missiles are more than capable of taking out almost any target in their way. That includes critical military assets and vital pieces of infrastructure, including the likes of command posts, headquarters, ammunition depots, airfields, hangars, ships, fuel storage facilities, bridges, ports, radar stations, air defense systems, and even hardened structures like reinforced bases and underground bunkers. And this isn't just hypothetical, it's proven. Tomahawks have been used since as far back as the early 1990s in the Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm, taking out surface-to-air missile sites, air defense facilities, and command posts with ease. Any military force equipped with Tomahawk missiles has the power to wipe enemy structures off the map whenever they want, and there's very little their opponents can do about it. The fourth and final big plus point of the Tomahawk is flexibility. It was created at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, designed to fulfill the US military's need for a medium to long-range cruise missile that was flexible enough to be fitted with a wide range of warheads. The development team decided on a modular design, which has since allowed more than a dozen different variants to be produced over the years. There are anti-ship variants of the Tomahawk, as well as numerous land attack variants equipped with different warheads to take out various types of targets. The Tomahawk design has also been upgraded on numerous occasions over the years, with new technologies introduced and integrated that make these missiles even more flexible and fearsome. All in all, Tomahawks deliver everything one would hope for in a cruise missile, whether it be exceptional range, destructive firepower, and awesome agility in the air. What's more, as mentioned earlier, these are missiles that have been proven in action. The US Air Force, Army, and Navy have all been equipped with Tomahawks over the years, and hundreds have been used in major conflicts and military operations. Over 300 were fired at key Iraqi targets during Operation Desert Fox in 1998, for example. Dozens more struck targets across Afghanistan in Operation Enduring Freedom in the wake of the September 11 terrorist attacks. Others have been used in Libya, Syria, and most recently Iran. Other armed forces around the world, including the British Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Royal Netherlands Navy, have also acquired Tomahawks from the US, and several other countries like Canada, Germany, Poland, and Spain have all expressed an interest in buying some of their own. There are many other cruise and ballistic missiles out there that appear excellent on paper or boast impressive technical specifications and capabilities. Ukraine is even leading the way in this field, recently revealing its long-range Flamingo missiles, for example. However, a lot of modern missile programs are untested and unproven in the field. The Tomahawk, however, has been in service for decades now, effectively destroying huge numbers of enemy targets. It's a highly reliable, immensely destructive piece of hardware and an invaluable addition to any arsenal. For Ukraine, it would be a game changer. And while there hasn't been any official decision to send Tomahawks to Ukraine at this time, it's something that's being looked at closely, according to the US Vice President J.D. Vance. Speaking in a September 28 interview with Fox News, Vance revealed,
"It's something the president's going to make the final determination on. What the president is going to do is what's in the best interest of the United States of America."
The vice president went on to add,
"But I know that we're having conversations this very minute about that issue."
Clearly, this is something that the US is very seriously considering, and it's something that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has called for on several occasions. Indeed, just days ago, news reports emerged detailing closed-door discussions that took place between Zelensky and Trump at the recent United Nations General Assembly event. During those talks, Zelensky reportedly asked Trump to provide long-range strike capabilities to Ukraine, arguing that Tomahawk missiles would help to pile pressure on Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, which could potentially lead to a peace deal. When asked by Axios about how these talks went, Zelensky appeared optimistic, stating that Trump was open to the idea and summing up his response with the words,
He said, "We will work on it."
Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, rejected a request for Tomahawks from Zelensky back in 2024, reportedly believing it would be too risky to equip Kyiv with such powerful long-range missiles. For a while, it seemed that Trump would follow a similar path. The 47th president initially appeared reluctant to aid Ukraine with more weapons, preferring instead to focus on pushing peace talks and suggesting ways to end the war through land swaps. In April of this year, for example, the US president said Crimea will stay with Russia. He also repeatedly urged Ukraine to agree to give up some of its occupied territories to Russia as part of ceasefire and peace negotiations. More recently, however, Trump's tone has pivoted quite dramatically in the opposite direction. In September, the Trump administration approved its first major US weapons aid packages for Ukraine. Funded by NATO's Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, the first shipments arrived a few days later. Then, Trump went one step further, making a bold proclamation on his social media site, Truth Social, in which he announced that Ukraine's forces could, in fact, recover all of their land that's been taken from them by Russia. After getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it's causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Trump also criticized Russia in his post, accusing it of fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years in a war that should have taken less than a week to win. It's a major shift in stance from the American leader, and one that suggests he's grown tired and frustrated of dealing with Putin's lies and false promises. This was, in effect, confirmed by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who recently revealed that Trump was really angry with Putin for refusing to engage with Trump's efforts to end the war. Trump has approved the delivery of several major American weapons systems to Ukraine as part of his administration's initial aid package, including Patriot air defenses and HIMARS rocket systems. He also, in his Truth Social post, stated, "We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them." This all seems to suggest that Trump may be willing to go the next level and let Ukraine have Tomahawks. And that would change everything, because Tomahawks would far exceed any other long-range missile system that Ukraine has received from its Western allies up to this point. They would enhance the Ukrainian arsenal in ways that almost no other weapon possibly could. As Borsari notes, Tomahawks would definitely be a significant upgrade for Ukraine's arsenal, especially in terms of long-range strike capabilities. It would allow Ukraine to deliver a much heavier payload against targets compared to what it's using now. This is because, despite Ukraine's excellent domestic missile programs, like the Long Neptune and Zapsan, it's still largely reliant on Western weapons and drones to carry out long-range attacks and deep strikes on Russian targets. In the iconic Operation Spiderweb attack earlier this year, for instance, Ukraine's forces used relatively simple drones, smuggled to key locations across Russia, to deal billions of dollars worth of damage to Russian aircraft and airfields. Ukraine also regularly conducts incredible drone strikes on important targets like oil refineries, pipelines, fuel storage facilities, and ammunition stocks. This all has a big effect, and Russia is currently facing an unprecedented oil crisis, with fuel shortages reported across the country thanks in large part to Ukraine's strategic strikes on fuel-related facilities. Ukraine's drones have also wiped out important radar systems, air defenses, command posts, and other important locations in Russia and occupied territories, weakening the Kremlin's war machine one piece at a time. There's no doubt that drone strikes are effective, but they're still not as devastating as cruise and ballistic missiles. As Ivan Stupak, former SBU officer and Ukrainian lawmaker, puts it, drones do cause damage. They can fly into windows at defense factories deep in Russia's rear. If they attack us, we will answer them. But let's be honest, 50 kilograms of explosives are just 50 kilograms. 500 kilograms in a missile can make a difference. That's one of the reasons why Russia regularly bombards Ukrainian towns and cities like Kyiv, not just with huge swarms of drones, but dozens of missiles too. Often the drones are designed to simply overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses so that the missiles can fly by and deal the biggest amounts of damage. And when it comes to missile stocks and strength, Russia versus Ukraine is a real mismatch. Russia is believed to have large stocks of Caliber-class cruise missiles to continue striking Ukrainian cities, and Iskander ballistic missiles too. Ukraine, meanwhile, has just limited numbers of Western missiles, like Storm Shadows and ATACMS, and though it's made serious strides with its own domestic missiles, it lacks the infrastructure to produce them in large amounts. The Flamingo, for example, boasts an amazing range of over 1,800 miles or up to 3,000 kilometers and carry warheads weighing over 2,500 pounds. There are conflicting reports about when it will actually enter serial production. Some say as early as 2025, others point to 2026. So its official status remains uncertain. That means Ukraine can't really build any sort of serious strategy around this missile for the time being. If, however, America was to send over a batch of Tomahawks, Ukraine could immediately make plans to carry out a whole range of devastating attacks on important Russian military targets. And the quantity of targets that would fall within the Tomahawks range is staggering. With Tomahawks, Ukraine could not only strike places in and around the Russian capital of Moscow, but even those much further away, in and around major cities like St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and Saratov, to name but a few examples. All of a sudden, countless new Russian air bases, command posts, oil refineries, and production plants would be at risk, and there's already extensive evidence of Ukraine's innovation, ingenuity, and efficiency when it comes to picking its targets and striking at the Kremlin's weakest and most valuable locations. Unlike Russia, which recklessly bombards Ukraine and seems to send its drones and missiles over the borders without any clear mission apart from killing as many people as possible, Ukraine does things differently. It chooses the targets that matter the most, the refineries, the ammo depots, and so on, the kinds of targets that truly cripple the Kremlin's war machine and make it much harder for Russia to advance, capture territory, and keep its fumbling economy afloat. In doing so, one strike at a time, Ukraine makes the war much harder for Russia to sustain, and at least in theory, puts more pressure on Putin to finally accept he's not going to get what he wants and agree to a peace deal. It's taking time and coming at a cost, but Ukraine's strategy is working. Russia's oil production capacities have taken a major hit. Its economy is weakening by the day, and its forces are struggling to gain ground along the front lines. Tomahawks could accelerate this entire process by an incalculable amount, giving Ukraine the power to take out dozens more critical Russian facilities and push the Kremlin to the brink of absolute catastrophe. At the same time, there are challenges for Kyiv to overcome if it wants to make the most of any Tomahawks it receives. For one thing, each Tomahawk missile is said to cost around $2 million, so it's highly unlikely the US would be willing to send a huge stockpile. But even a small amount would be enough for Kyiv to deal serious damage to its enemies, as long as it treated them with care and planned its attacks with the same sort of precision and strategy seen so far, reducing the risk of any missiles going to waste. The second big challenge relates to launchers, because missiles like these require specialist launch platforms to fire from. As Vadim Skibitsky, deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, GUR, explains, Tomahawks are not easy to use. Skibitsky told The Guardian earlier this year, "The main launchers are combat ships or strategic bombers. We don't have any strategic bomber aircraft." As such, the US will not only have to provide the missiles themselves, but also launch platforms like Typhoons to fire them from. Alternatively, Ukraine's other NATO allies would have to construct and provide a suitable platform, which would demand more time, money, and resources. This could push back any possible Tomahawk strikes on Russia, giving the Kremlin more valuable time to ramp up its aggression along the front lines. Because of these issues, some analysts have suggested that the US supply Ukraine with Tomahawk alternatives, like Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, JASM. Borsari notes that these missiles would be easier for Kyiv's forces to work with. It has a range of roughly 1,000 kilometers, it's very powerful, and it could be a good solution for Ukraine, and much easier to integrate into Ukrainian aircraft compared to the Tomahawk. Meanwhile, other allies of Ukraine are also looking into ways to strengthen Kyiv's deep strike capabilities. Germany, for example, has announced it will supply long-range missiles to Ukraine very shortly, very soon, according to Chancellor Friedrich Merz. This, combined with whichever additional weapons the US decides to send, will strengthen Ukraine enormously, delivering a much-needed boost to its missile supplies and pushing Russia well and truly onto the back foot as the conflict continues. Now, learn more about how bad the situation is becoming in Russia in our recent breakdown of the dramatic fuel crisis sweeping the nation. Alternatively, check out our video on another recent upgrade to Ukraine's arsenal. Gripen fighter jets from Sweden, famed for their speed, agility, and advanced technologies, and ready to help Kyiv gain an all-important aerial advantage. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can find out about important new developments and frontline events from the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts across the globe.